the reflection. Right. How were we so deceived? Great statement. I love that one. It's so open-ended. With Brexit, with our current government, etc., etc. It's a very, very open-ended statement. So these are, I'm hoping, will become part of the fabric of the town. They're also going to be part of an online project being run by a friend of mine in Wellington, New Zealand. So they'll be printed off and made there. I've got one or two now going over in the States. Regarding my activity as an artist and where my work perhaps is coming from and what my value system is. One thing that's very interesting is that before returning to England and the lockdown period, I showed art in galleries. I had friends that would take a look at what I was making. I'd enter competitions. I was reviewed a couple of times in magazines. And so in a way, it was about an outer world. It was about producing something that I knew would have an audience. Spending time in a studio with no forthcoming exhibitions, with social distancing prohibiting any of my local friends who make things coming, having a look, seeing what I'm doing. It means that I've had to rethink in quite a profound way why make things. What is the point of it? Because there is no feedback. There is no. I'm working effectively within an echo chamber without any kind of external validation. One text, I'll just very quickly read this out because as I read it the other day, it said from the New York Times. It was published it was a review of an exhibition at Massmocha by Jason Farago on July the 23rd. So it's a week or so back. And it's a review of a group show at Massmocha. And at the end of it, he makes the following claims. He says, apologies for going all Kantian, but what's revealed in the COVID-era museum is that art's political power still derives, above all, from having no pragmatic application. It can't fix the world. It doesn't function as a slower, more elite communication medium. It stands for itself. It confronts our imagination and our intellect, and so it shapes our capacities as free citizens. If I seek out art in a time of national catastrophe, it's not because I need that catastrophe explained to me, and it's not because I want to block that catastrophe out with a veil of pretty pictures. It's simpler than that. It's because I need to be reminded what to live for. And when I read that, it struck me as resonating very strongly with the kind of ideas I've been having about the new work I've been making. I'm not in any way denigrating political artwork which is addressing global concerns, the ecological catastrophe that's looming, the increased awareness regarding the Black Lives Matter movement, which in fact marched past my studio window a few weeks ago. I'm fully behind those activities. However, I've realized that for me at this point in time, and I'm quoting here again Jason Farago's review, the reason I make things is not to point out, as I perhaps was in my earlier work, what I find to be wrong within the work, in the world, excuse me, but to try and find that creative moment which somebody like Joseph Beuys might argue is inherent in every human being, that the drive to create is not something that belongs purely to a specialist stratum in society or an expert or a special category, but is something which is in all of us, and is not something that is driven by technique nor a certain awareness of the history of art or anything like that, but comes from the same place that I was perhaps referencing with regard to my meditation practice, that lurking within each and every one of us is a spark of creativity, at the risk of sounding rather romantic, that before the lockdown, or before my life changed enormously, had been squashed by the need to have status, to earn my living, to represent myself to the world in a particular way. So I guess what I'm getting at is that my ideas about art and what my time in this studio is spent doing is not generating something that might bring me plaudits and worldly acclaim, but is to re-engage, I guess, with something that I feel I've lost. One thing I've been working on, and here's where I'm just going to move my computer a little, so forgive anyone looking at the seasickness that I might generate here. But I've been centering the body of work. Is it all right if I just move backwards a little and show some of the pictures here? If I just pop my computer over here for a moment, what you see behind me are a wall of images that I've been making since lockdown, that I work in a very ad hoc kind of a way. There's no overarching plan in terms of what images, materials, etc. I might want to use. What I'm using as my map, or as a kind of a diagram effectively of what I'm doing, is a body of work that's in the Ipswich mansion, the town I live in, which is a closet of paintings. There you go, high-tech stuff here. Made by Lady Anne Bacon Drury 400 years ago. And she was not an artist. She was not part of an art scene. She was a woman who was, at that point in history, locked away in a mansion while her husband was a very important figure in the London political scene. She made 48 small paintings that reflected her disappointment with her own position in society, with her Puritanism, effectively, with the way that life seemed to reward men, people in power, and she felt as though she'd been on the outside of that. Each one of the panels comes with a short Latin inscription, and one thing I've been working on is, if I stand back for a moment, reworkings. They have been translated into English here, little sayings that, as I said, are 400 years old. If I just come in a little bit, perhaps you can see the red collection, just to read some of them, which, for me at least, still resonate. That are almost like Buddhist koans. They have that very open-ended sort of meaning, which I hope people might take away their own connections with. But the one I'm thinking of, particularly with what I was saying earlier, is this idea great learning has made me stupid. I spent a great deal of my life believing that the way forward as an artist, as a human being, is to understand, is to rationally grasp what I'm doing, to be able to explain it to somebody else, that everything I make should have at its root an explanation, something which I could return to or explicate when necessary. That I have rejected since lockdown, and this is interesting to me that it's 400 years ago that she made this observation. I've recognized that often as not, that learning has stood in my way. It's not something that has helped me become a better artist, whatever better may mean here, but is something perhaps that has limited me and constrained what I'm making. And so one of the enormous and liberating breakthroughs I've made during the period we're all living in right now is to let go, and it's a process, right? I'm not there yet, but to try and let go of that part of me that needs affirmation from other people. I moved back to Britain 12, 13 months ago now, obviously before the lockdown and coronavirus had arrived. And my general impression, unfortunately, was a rather grim one in terms of my leaving England at the end of the 90s, Tony Blair, who I hate, and this whole sort of boom time in terms of economics. And I arrived back here after 10 years of Tory government austerity programs, which have effectively ripped the centre out of the town that I was raised in and now live in. Another big shift before I come to the coronavirus period was that Ipswich here is one of the magnet towns for refugees. And so with the international, well, the predominantly European problem with the refugee crisis in the last decade or two, we've seen a huge shift of people living here who are immigrants effectively, and that's, with Brexit in mind, kicked off a lot of, treading delicately here, racism effectively against people who have come here to make a better lives for themselves, and so on. And so the England that I remember from the 90s has been replaced in many ways with a rather more angry England than the one that I remember.
How did the lockdown look like in Great Britain?
Mismanaged is, I guess, the first word I would use. We were watching, from our perspective, speaking from England, coronavirus emerging in China. I have a friend whose daughter lives in Wuhan, and she was filling us in with stories of an alien, almost sci-fi lifestyle where you weren't allowed out. The shopping arrived at your front door. Exercise involved running up and down a stairwell in the flat, in the block of flats that she lived in. And so to begin with, it seemed like a strange anomaly, and that it was the stuff of sci-fi. It then, obviously, as you all know, spread. But for a long while, I guess, here we felt immune to some extent, as though it was something that was happening elsewhere. And there was a very strange period. I remember coming to my studio and listening, as I often do, to the radio, and there being debates about whether or not the Crufts dog show should open because maybe it would be dangerous. And this is that fuzzy period when it was unsure whether or not it may be the flu that would come and go magically, or whether it was a genuinely serious pandemic. And there was a very unsettling period when, on the radio again I'm talking about, there would be a lot of anger on both sides of this divide in terms of whether or not we should bluff our way through this and carry on as normal with that stiff upper lip that the English are famous for, and keep calm and carry on, or whether we should seriously look at what was going on in places like Germany, where it was being taken very seriously. My friends in France also were pointing to a very harsh lockdown regimen. And so I was of the opinion that, and my friends, my family, that we should be dead serious about this. But there was a lot of ambiguity, especially coming from the government, in terms of what the best way forward might be. And so there were 2 to 3 to 4 weeks perhaps lost in terms of cracking down very early on. So the beginnings of lockdown were not clear cut. It was not as though there was a day upon which life changed. It's although there was 23rd, I think, of March, a day when we were effectively ordered to stay home. But it was preceded by a lot of toing and froing and ambiguity and debate in terms of what the best way of coping might be. It reminded me, having been in the States for a long while, of the culture wars there in terms of a divided society. On the one hand, those of the opinion that we might look outside of Britain and follow the lead that South Korea imposed, for example, with a very sophisticated track and trace program, with a sort of a much more nativist approach, which said, well, that's all fine and well, but that's over there and we do things differently here in England, and this is how we're going to go about it. And so it seemed effectively a lightning rod for kind of culture wars that in the States we see with mask wearing and so on and so on.